This is the final module for the course. In this module, I'd just like to mention two other shell customization options that you have at your disposal. The first is called umask. The program called umask is used to specify the permissions that all files created by the shell should have. Before we can have a look at that, we've obviously got to recall how we create files using the shell. Can you remember that? And I'm not talking about vi. How does the shell program create files? Well, we use the greater than sign. Can you remember? Let's have a look. I might simply type who greater than wholist, and I'll get a list of users in my file called wholist. Let's do a little ls-l of wholist. I want you specifically to look at the permissions. They are rw-, r-, r-. Now what are they numerically speaking? If I was to create those using chmod, that would be 644. Can you remember that? 6 for read-write, and 4 for read-only, and 4 for read-only. So 644. Now why is it that that is the default set of permissions? Obviously that's been specified somewhere. Let's see if we can't change that. The usage for umask is as follows. You type in umask followed by the permissions for the files that are going to be created later by the shell. Very interesting. You've got to be fully comfortable with this fact. The permissions that you specify are like those of chmod's numeric mode, in other words the 644, except that the permissions specify which permission should be turned off. Not which permission it should be turned on, or which permission should be set to, but actually which are turned off. Let's have a look at an example. Suppose you entered the command 022. Now what that means is that all files that you subsequently create will have permissions of 644. In other words, rw-, r-, r-. Now how do you get 644 from 022? And the answer is you subtract them from 666. Why 666? Well, 666 is considered the full permissions, read-write for everybody. And note that the execute permission has got nothing to do with the umask program. You've actually got to completely ignore execute permission as far as umask is concerned. So if you take away all of the execute stuff, which would have been 777, then you're left with 666. Then with umask you specify which permissions should be turned off. So if you take those away, then you're left with the real permissions that all the files will actually have. I know it sounds weird, but you tend to only have to do this once. You do it and you put it in your .profile and then you forget about it. But let's just have a little go at it. Let's see if we can practice. What if I create a umask of, let's say, 444? That's a particularly weird one. You wouldn't do that very often, but I can do it. And then if I create another file, wholist2, let's say for example, then I do ls-l of wholist2, and I find that the 444 part has been turned off. In other words, all the r's have been turned off, leaving just the w's. So those permissions will be applied to every single file that I create from now on. I guess it's even possible to specify a umask like this, 606 for example, and then I'll create another file called wholist3 and do an L, or I'll just use a previous command line of 3, and then I can see that I've turned off both the permissions for the owner and both the permissions for others, and all I'm left with are the permissions for the group, which I haven't turned any of those off. So if you find yourself constantly doing a chmod to change the permissions on the files that you've just created, you might consider changing the default permissions using umask.